a roadmap of what I'm going to go through. When Stephen and I talked about this months and months ago, there wasn't even something called COVID we were aware of, right? It was going to be a slightly different talk. And then a lot changed. A lot changed in the world. And we talked about it. And it was important to kind of zoom out a little bit to the context of what is happening. So in the talk, there are a few topics that I want to go over. One is there is something quite dramatic and quite important taking place right now, I believe, and that is the next evolution of design. That is actually taking place right now under our feet. And there is this unlikely and curious alignment between how design leaps forward from stage to stage in its evolution and how that is aligned to crises. And there's something that is forming right now that we are all part of, a new global world. And I want to talk also about unleashing the power of a very broad set of humanity during this time. And finally, I want to, from there, move towards 21st century tools for building 21st century products and connect that to design forms. So go ahead, let's go ahead and jump in. So this was a newspaper from yesterday, right? This is what I saw yesterday. Highest unemployment in the last 100 years happening in Seattle, where I mean, this was the news in Seattle, but this is of course happening in the US. And at the same time, the news said Seattle's going to close 20 miles of streets to traffic so residents can exercise and bike. And this is forever. This is not just for the time we are in lockdown. So our world is changing in very quickly in very unusual ways, and it's kind of a split screen. So this is a time where change is happening at just such a phenomenal pace. You know, there are entire decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where entire decades take place. And we are in those weeks right now. And one thing that has become really clear is that the future that we thought was unfolding in January or in February is no longer the future. The future is not what it was, and the cone of uncertainty of the future is extremely wide right now. And of course, that brings at this point a lot of anxiety. It brings all kinds of emotions, sadness at seeing what's going on. And in all of that, we can miss something really important that is going on if we're not looking for it. And what that is, my contention is that what is happening at this very moment, which is relevant to our conversation today, is that the next big evolution of design is taking place right now under our feet. And we may not be able to recognize it right now. And I want to share some frameworks that maybe help us look at that and then provide some more evidence as we go along. So in about 1992, somebody called Richard Buchanan, who's a professor at Carnegie Mellon, he now teaches at Case Western, really smart guy, proposed something called the 4 orders of design. Design being that different levels of scale are really what define the different orders of design. The first order being about communication, the next about artifacts, the third about interactions, fourth about systems. G.K. Van Patter took that same idea and called these challenge arenas, right, in different levels of complexity. So I'm building on both of their work and really using GK's terminology. And really, in this talk, I'll use the framing of design 1.0 being the design of communications and products, and design 2.0 being the design of experiences and services, design 3.0 being about organizational transformation. Organizations could be companies, could be cities, could be various kinds of organizations. And design 4.0 is about social and planetary transformation. And really, just to sort of skip ahead to what I'm talking about, evolutions, I think we are right now in a moment where we are moving from design 3.0 to design 4.0. So where did this whole thing begin, Design 1.0? One of the places that it began was right here. This is Florence in the 14th century. There was something really amazing taking place at this moment. We were witnessing the birth of the Renaissance. There was this extraordinary burst of creativity that is happening. There was Leonardo da Vinci, who was bridging art and science, the ultimate Renaissance man, who was creating both the Mona Lisa and creating these fantastic machines. There was also Botticelli creating things like the Birth of Venus. There was Michelangelo, who was doing the Sistine Chapel, and David, and then there was Galileo. So in a very short amount of time, there's a whole bunch of people who were really creating this bridge between art and design, art and science, and creating the first shapes of design. People say, why then? Why in Tuscany? Why in Florence? Why in this short time? There are different theories. Some say that it was the Medicis. The Medicis were these bankers who were, they were patrons of the arts. Lorenzo de' Medici was a catalyst himself, a cross-disciplinary advocate, and a design thinker, right? So that's one view, but that's not the whole story. There's this thought that maybe great men were just born in Tuscany, right? They were able to rise to prominence because the cultural conditions there were very favorable for this kind of cross-pollination between art and science and to create design. Actually, if you look at it, it's not such a favorable time. It was kind of this repressive feudal society, ruled by hierarchy. So there was a 1%, there was a rise of various dogmas, high level of disparity. And in fact, the 1% were fond of sending their ships out across the world to go get silk from China, spices from the Spice Islands, and there was also this time in Florence, cultures were mixing because of these things. Entrepreneurs, shipbuilders were going out everywhere, bringing back goods and so on. And one of the things they brought back was a black rat. And the black rat brought the flea, and that brought the plague. And so Florence was the epicenter of the plague. The Black Death, which hit Europe like between 1348 and 1355, and it created a huge impact. Italy was the worst hit, and it's really broke down the society and created conditions where the new could be born. And that was the place where the new thinkers like the Leonardos in this hopeless time were really creating a new future. So what Florence really became this laboratory within the new, in which the new was born, right? And this where Design 1.0 was born. And if you think about it, where was that actually being created by Leonardo and others? This was in these ateliers, and this is important for our talk because if you look at this particular space that sort of supported this, we see that there is, it supports the activities, one, of being very visual, of learning by doing, of prototyping, of making, of having the right kind of sort of mix of 2D and 3D. Of course, this was the atelier of the lone genius. And it was a time where Design 1.0 was about lone geniuses who were bridging things individually. Fast forward, let's go many centuries forward, and we go to another time in design, and this is where we can say Design 2.0. We do that bridge from communications and products, so now we start to see experiences arrive. We are now moved to the new world. We moved to America, and we moved to early 1900s, the 1920s. And there is a new clarity of vision taking place here. This is the time when Norman Bell Geddes is doing this heroic design around, reinventing every aspect of the landscape, from automobiles to radios. This is the time when Walter Darwin Teague is reinventing objects, completely changing them, from the baby brownie camera to just a whole host of objects. This is the time where Henry Dreyfuss is creating human scale, creating and the new telephones, creating tractors. So, there is this time of huge reinvention. And Raymond Loewy, who's designing things from really humble domestic objects to the Avanti Starlight and to creating locomotives, right? And if we look at the kind of processes that he's using, a lot of these were about drawing and making. And those he was behind the first Air Force One, where he was um, talking about how he was working with the president and sort of co-designing. But this is a quote. He says, "I brought along sheets of colored paper, scissors, razor blades, and rubber cement. Since his desk at the Oval Office was relatively small, we sat on the floor cutting out colored paper shapes, working out various ideas. We had 3 sessions." So there was a sense of, now there is a sense of collaboration that's happening. It's not just about this lone genius, a collaboration. And now there's also this notion of a space within which this happens that becomes important. And we start to see in this time where there is the Futurama exhibit in which a new vision of the country is being prototyped. The notion of highways gets created over here, right? And so we're seeing, instead of going just simply objects, this is the entire experiences that are being created. Why was this happening in America at this time? And why so much energy? Why all of these people creating at this time? If we sort of scrape the surface, we find again that this was the time right after the Spanish flu, the largest pandemic that happened, right? Somewhere, nobody really knows, but somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died of the Spanish flu. And this is, the Spanish flu sets off the collapse in Wall Street. Black Friday, we start to have hunger, we start to have a whole bunch of things happening in the country. And from the midst of all of this, the American design century is born, right? And the American design century is, again, just like the Renaissance that came out of sort of the hopeless times of the plague. The American design century, hope for the future, again comes from this hopeless time, right? The new laboratory where American design is born. Of course, this time there is a different important player, which is mass market, the things being created in multiples. Fast forward to where we can see really design 3.0, right? We look at the Bauhaus. There's actually a whole a period within this Bauhaus, the new laboratory within the new within which the next design is created. The Bauhaus was really this place in Germany which was sort of investigation of the new materials of the time, and it is really some of the ideas that came out from the Bauhaus, are still the ideas that are used today, the international architectural style, the work that finds its way into Braun, the work of Dieter Rams, and that eventually finds its way into the work of Apple and Muji, and all the kind of design that today we see, not only in the physical world, but also in the digital world, all goes back there. And again, if we look back and look at the story of the Bauhaus, where does it come from? It comes from the wars. It comes from old hierarchies being broken down, the economic malaise of the wars, creating again a world that is feels very volatile, uncertain, very full of change and ambiguity. And again, in all these times, we see the search for authenticity, the search for breaking down the old order and creating new order is a time where design thrives, right? And so we see in this arc of the development of design 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0, we see that, we reach a place where today, we come to a place where design has this prominent place in our society, right? Which is sort of in the peak of its time. And again, the kind of spaces where this work gets created are these studios where collaboration happens, studios where people get together. What is common across all of these design 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, of course, is this one notion, which is about unleashing creativity, whether it is of the lone genius Leonardo, or whether it's a collective group of people coming together. It is that raw human creativity which somehow turns into a result. and outcome. And what emerges in Design 3.0, Design 1.0 was really about sort of the individual genius and their creativity. They were able to extract it from their mind and their own private method. And then we see in Design 2.0 that is somehow the visionary designer who is able to describe their own methods. In Design 3.0, we start to see the rise of design thinking. The idea that there is a systematic method and there are certain stages that people can go through, and this can be trained and taught. And these are these stages that we're familiar with. You know, you first need to understand your customer. You need to gain empathy. Once you gain empathy, you need to be able to somehow understand needs. From understand needs, you need to frame problems, and from those problems, you will create goals. From goals, you're at a point where you create ideas. You need to create multiplicity of ideas. From those, there are systematic ways where you find the best ideas. And from that selection, you start iterating, you start experimenting, you prototype, and then you test and you validate and iterate and narrate those. So this very solid and repeatable and elastic design thinking process is today practiced by many. So really, in some sense, there are many Leonardos of our time who managed to take that creative process, thanks to the way that the heuristic of design thinking has been defined, are able to utilize that. Let's fast forward to our times. So we've for a while, our things on the planet have been moving in ways that leave all of us a little bit unsettled, right? We feel very strongly we have this particular moment in history where there are two paths forward. There's a dystopian future and a utopian future. And there is tons of bad news coming, right? We are living at a time where the environment seems to be breaking down. We seem to find a time where all our fellow species are getting impacted. Lots of species are going extinct. There are things like some of the basics like air we can no longer count on. We seem to be getting to be a crowded planet. We have 7.2 billion humans right now. We're going towards 9 billion humans. We've been fighting over oil. Now we started fighting over water. We've got cities that are larger than countries. And then it sounds like some of the things that we democratized consumption, and that so more people could own things, but that became a runaway train. And now we see all the kind of impact of the environment. And this is just scratching the surface. We clearly live at this very disquieting time, right? And we are at this time when there are thousands and thousands of wicked problems that need to be solved. We also live at a time when there's something else that's happening on the planet, which is we have become this digitally powered planet. This is a planet that is also interconnected. It's a global planet that is interconnected digitally. And that's happening at the same time as we seem to have all these challenges going on. And we see that has a direct impact on how we build stuff, right? It shows up in terms of how the interaction with products. We have novel ways that we actually interact with the world anymore. We interact through voice, we interact through gesture, we interact through touch. We also digitize pretty much everything now. So everything turns digital. So reality is turned digital. And we're seeing a flip side of that, where digitality is also turning physical with the rise of additive manufacture and 3D printing. And underlying all of this is, of course, this notion of infinite compute. More transistors on the planet today than there are grains of rice, right? And soon more sensors on the planet than there'll be grains of rice. So this time, if we look at Design 2.0, came out of mass manufacture. This has also started to erode one of the things that Design 2.0 came from, because we might be reaching the end of mass manufacture. We might be reaching a point where our cars may be 3D printed, only one of those exists in the planet. We are starting to see where the notion of who's a designer and who's a user might be, or consumer might be changing. For instance, most shoe companies now offer you a way that you can go design your own shoe and it gets built and shipped to you. We're starting, rather than have a designer, a Raymond Louis, who designs it for you, and then you only buy it. So that line between who's a designer and who's a consumer is shifting. We're also starting to see the rise of the maker movement. super evident in our moment right now, right? We are seeing more and more people are becoming makers, and it's happening spontaneously around the world. And we are starting to have different models of how we make stuff. We don't make and tune something perfectly, put it around the world. We move fast, break things, as Facebook's motto had, and done is better than perfect. And so we're seeing there is this movement. We've gone from the classical design thinking, you can say sort of the age, the Leonardos. We moved into classical design and Leonardos all the way up to the Raymond Lewis, to the notion of design thinking. And we think about IDEO, we think of Frog Design, we think of Stanford D School, we think about what is being done across a bunch of corporates, the age of design thinking. And we're moving into a new age, which is the notion of computation design, digitally powered design at a global scale, right? And so it starts to raise real questions about, so if we knew this ateliers which were used in the first stage and the studios in the next, how are we doing this at this point? Now this, which has been building up, this notion of how we design with computation in multiple ways, with algorithms as our co-workers, while we use digital ways we connect with each other, and multiple different ways that we use computation. It comes to our tools. We find that our tools are really struggling a little bit with this. Our tools, if you look at the tools of the past, which were really made for sort of creative aha moments, to be able to break through and create beautiful things, many of our tools right now seem to fall short. And we also see some of the things that we build with those tools seem to fall short, right? We have got a little bit of a Frankenstein effect happening when we create things like, the Tay robot, which had to be shut down within hours because it turned homophobic and racist. Or we see the problems with Cambridge Analytica and democracy. We see challenges like the poor citizens of Hawaii who raced in droves because they thought missiles are coming, because are landing on them, because somebody put an OK cancel button in the wrong location, right? And so there is a host of issues around, the fact that a few of us on the planet get to use these kind of tools. The tools are not very good. They don't really help us design very well. And most of the people who use them tend to be in spaces such as this, and tend to be of privilege, and tend to have access to digital and so on. While the people who use the results of that often are more like this, far more distributed and diverse, right? So one framing of the problem really of our time in this age where we're globally interconnected on this digitally powered planet is that the red dot is the number of people who are the creators of stuff, and the rest are really users of stuff. And of course, we've got a ton of issues going on, right? When we talk about those wicked problems, a lot of those are neglected today because those are just not the problems that the small group of makers is really focused on. Really, what we're talking about, distributed problems and the need for distributed solutions, that people who actually use things get an opportunity to be able to actually make stuff. Now, there's some good news. How we build things is changing very, very dramatically. And that's changed really dramatically even in the last 10 or 15 years. Greg Petroff, who leads UX at ServiceNow, inspired me when he was talking about this, and he's talking about how some of the changes in how we build are because our business models are all moving to services, right? We know it's Uber, Airbnb, and all of these various business models are quickly shifting. And so what happens is when we're shifting from old models to new models, the advantages of being an incumbent become less. We're moving to infrastructure as a service. It used to be the only people who could be the producers, who could build stuff, were people who could own large factories, could own injection molding presses, could have the trucks that moved things around, could employ lots of people, could have advertising spend. But today we're moving to a place where, you can have a credit card of a few $100s, go buy some AWS or Azure, have a great idea, and start within uh, weeks or even days or even minutes to start to build something. So the way we build is starting to change. So the field is opening up to more than a privileged view, right? And as you can see where my argument's going, we're going up the stack where platforms turning into a service, right? So chunks of functionality, databases as service, algorithms as a service. We're starting to chunk things out so more people get a chance to become builders. Even the other barrier of having to know how to write software doesn't exist anymore, because you can buy chunks of code if you have an idea. And even interaction design itself turns service when we start to have pattern libraries and entire chunks of, say, checkout chunk, a first use chunk. So that has become becoming a service. So more and more people get an opportunity to get into the game. And what gets really interesting for me is, so how do we unleash then that raw creativity of 7.2 billion humans and think about creativity as a service? How do we empower that? So what's happening really is we're moving from the problem that existed was how to build. The big problem was how to build. And we moved from that to the new problem is what to build. Should you build that chatbot that might become homophobic, right? What should you build? Why should you build things? Should you build products that risk breaking democracy, right? Why do you build? And then the other part, who gets to build, right? Who gets to build becomes really important. So there's all kinds of interesting futures that open up when we open a question that a lot of more people get to build. So my own beliefs are all lives are equal and all people are intrinsically creative. And it turns out a few of us, particularly folks who have had really good educations, get to unleash their creative power, right? Because they learn these frameworks and they have tools and so on that they can use to unleash creative power. But when humans can channel their creative power, they can do incredible things. They can do incredible things for themselves, for their families, for their communities, for their towns, their cities, perhaps even the world, right? And so this, for me, that key that takes that creativity that's in human minds and turns it into outcomes is the design thinking process. That same thing that Leonardo was using without describing it, that's what maybe Lowy was hinting at when he was working with the president on Air Force One. The thing that's become the design thinking method, that is the design thinking process. And so my mission has been to unleash the design thinker in every person and organization to become a value creator, to really use the design thinking process to guide creativity to become results. So the particular method that I've developed for that is something called design swarms, which is to turn that into into process maps. And of course, recognizing that there's not just one creative process, that there are multiple different kinds of creative processes, some that tend to be more fuzzy end processes, others that tend to be about detailing, some are just really complex processes of very difficult problems. So the idea was to create process maps. I started with turning the design thinking process into a process map that anybody who's not a designer can use, and then experimented with this in a number of places. And what emerged was the need to actually break it down into more of a system. And so so design swarms is a system of a whole set of process maps that, depending on the shape of the problem, whether it's a fuzzy front-end problem, whether it's a problem of iteration, whether it is a problem that is a relatively simple problem that you just need to move through, or it's a problem you need to solve in a very short amount of time, you can piece together the Lego kits of these process maps so that even somebody who does not have any design education, has never heard about design, can be quickly facilitated through a process well, facilitate the process. It typically takes at least about 6 to 7 hours to work through a problem, where you can start and move through the entire arc of the design thinking process, from moving through problem space and working your way into solution space and go through it systematically. This is kind of what it looks like when one of these process maps, or in this case, 3 process maps, are completed. This is a group of folks who suffered opioid addiction, working with emergency room physicians, frontline responders, and a few design students figuring out ways to prevent addiction. It looks, as people work through this, they they begin by gaining empathy, start by forming teams, they start to understand creative thinking styles, and then they go ahead and understand the human they're going to serve, have systematic ways by which they describe that human, gain empathy for them, get the right kind of data, tend to describe the nature of the problem itself, and using very tried and tested methods like journey maps and ways to extract challenges, adaptation maps, and then convert those into needs and goals, and take goals and then go through systematic ideation methods, about 43 of them. And so use some of those methods to get a whole bunch of ideas, then be able to select the right ideas, go through a validation, in this case, using a method called a BXT validation, a business experience technology validation, and then come to a result which they are able to storyboard and describe that so that it can be tested with folks who might use it, and be able to pitch it. And in a very short amount of time, these move to results. So this is really a sprint approach with a very prescriptive a process map approach, which allows folks with absolutely no design experience to be able to move through that. Now, it's turned out that this has been something that I've had the opportunity to run around the world, from both using it for extremely low resource communities to be able to use it in some of the large corporates, corporate places like Amazon and Microsoft, T-Mobile, and a bunch of other places to solve problems. What has been, now coming to our particular moment, I talked about this moment is special. I talked about how we are moving from design 3.0 to 4.0. And so this is the connection. In the past 2 months, something extraordinary has been happening. And what's been happening is, very organically and spontaneously, people around the world, remember, we're all around the world facing our first global event. And in this global event, we are also interconnected because of the kind of communication technologies we have thanks to the internet, right? And there has been this amazing burst of creativity where humans are unleashing their own creativity. People are taking scuba gear and turning it into ventilators. People are creating do-it-yourself ventilators, right? People are pivoting their businesses and factories overnight to respond to creating these ventilators and other needs. Here's Dyson, a vacuum cleaner maker, who in less than a week pivoted their assembly line to create a ventilator, and they're creating 50,000 of them, right? Here is another example of a group of folks who will learn to split a ventilator. Others are figuring out how to turn airports into hospitals. People are starting to think of the future post-COVID world, and what will new offices be like if we need to have 6 feet spacing. In India, the Indian Railways stopped the trains, but turned the trains that were parked into hospitals. Phone booths got turned into testing booths. So extraordinary amount of creativity that is taking place everywhere on the planet, and people are just figuring it out. Here's an example of somebody who doesn't have a hand, who looks like this person learned how to use a 3D printer to empower themselves, and now is using it to help and protect others. And so we see this everywhere. Creativity has just bubbled to the front as we see people gather at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in various cities, and they express their creative selves. And this is from villages in India. They're folks who are expressing how you protect yourself against COVID using folk ways of drawing. So here we seem to have, at our own pandemic moment, something's emerging, which is not just emerging in the ateliers of a Leonardo or in the studios of a Raymond Loewy. Billions of creative minds are actually starting to unleash themselves. So we are seeing the first blurry shape of a design powered planet and design 4.0. So the interesting thing for me here right now that I'm working on, the original talk was really going to go into a detail of the remote design swarms and some of the mechanics of it and so on. It became important to have this framing talk, but where we talked about how some of the challenges that we have today in our tools, right, our online tools, which have some real problems if we're using online these whiteboarding tools. Again, they are tuned towards a few. Most people get lost in them. These tools are being used not in spaces where people sit together, but where cats are wandering across screens and children are tugging at parents' legs because they got hungry and because it is being done on dining tables and so on. And so there's a need for these tools to evolve, and this is where Design Swarms is moving into this remote framework, because that line of sight, which has been so useful for people who've been non-designers to be able to get into design, is something that is proving to be handy in remote design swarm. So I do want to pause here and open up for some questions. So just to summarize, we are at this moment where the next evolution of design is taking place right now. We may not notice it in this very anxious moment, but something huge is taking place right now. I mean, in this very sad, distressing, scary moment, something is coming out of here. This moment where crisis has pushed the possibility of design moving forward. It's not a guarantee, but it's a possibility of shepherding forward when we start to think that the builders and designers of future products are not really who maybe for the past products, that we can actually include a large amount of humanity into the building process. And there is the moment when new tools are forming to be able to allow more people into it, right? And so we are actually going to be doing this facilitation to teach whoever's interested how to facilitate remote design swarms using this framework, and to these process maps that have now gone online, and how to actually use them. So please, if you're interested, please do go ahead and express your interest so that we can get back to you. I'll stop there and see and take some questions. Stephen?
Yeah, everybody can answer or send Surya a question in the Q&A box. And while we're waiting for those to come in, I have a couple questions, Surya.
Yes.
You know, I'm really, I'm both inspired and worried about this idea of crisis propelling design and forward. How do you talk to customers about that with relationship to their businesses when you're going in and helping them work through their current crisis? How do you help them see that it's okay for them to reset in a way and to think differently so that they can move forward?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, because finally we're part of businesses that are trying to make a profit and trying to get something of value, where there's a value exchange, where we provide something. And if we say, what is this world where everybody is designing, what happens to? So a couple of things. One is, I think it's not a world where everybody becomes a designer. Everybody becomes a design thinker. There's a difference between that. So the level of skill, I think it's 3 different levels of skill. There's still going to be highly skilled people. So there's folks who will be design literate, who can contribute there are people who are design masterful and people who are design fluent. So first of all, by going through or using tools or going through some quick process doesn't turn somebody into a designer. That's one. The next piece is within every organization today, there's a whole bunch of people who are just canceling each other out because there is a huge amount of creative potential within organizations that is just not being tapped into, right? And so for businesses, when I go to the opportunity is to increase velocity by using methods such as design swarms to be able to get everybody's creativity going so you can increase your velocity, increase your product market fit.
That makes sense. Here's a question that came in from Natalie. I guess I don't understand the difference between this and design thinking. I guess it comes from the nature of the problem. Could you give a couple of examples of a front end problem or some of the others you mentioned so that you can choose the appropriate process map?
Right. Yep. I'll talk about a social impact problem as an example. So there was a social impact problem which was really about women being homeless in Seattle, right? And this had been a problem that had been very resistant to solutions. And it was resistant to solutions partly because some of the knowledge of the firsthand experience of women in their when they get homeless was just not finding its way into the problem solving process. Now the constraint there was the notion there was to actually bring people who had experienced homelessness and have them work through the problem. And so the constraint was really to find one could get them only for a short amount of time, and also some of the process maps which might be around, say, designing an A/B experiment, right? Or something about maybe designing conversation design are not relevant. So it would be just the sort of basic processes of sort of understanding what the problem is, getting some ideas, and coming up with some quick solutions. So those were used, and there the insight that came from the participants who had all experienced homelessness firsthand and who are all women was the insight that actually that when they working together through the process, the insight was that when a woman becomes homeless, it's often the problem's not just losing a roof over her head. The problem also is often about her having lost her identity because she many times her documents tend to get withheld from her, right? And so she can't authenticate herself when she goes to a shelter. And so the particular solution that came out of it was actually to find a way for at-risk folks to be able to have a place to store their information in a private way online, so that if they were to get homeless at 2 o'clock at night, they could quickly get to that information and be able to authenticate themselves to find a homeless shelter. Now, it turned out when these solutions were being solved for this problem, it typically came from, let's build more shelters, right? Let's throw more money at this, and not understanding this particular point, which is a very sensitive point in that. So that was an example of a solution that came out from something like about going through this process in about 7 hours or so.
Here's the next question from Ali. What are your thoughts on the relationship between raw creativity versus domain expertise or subject matter expertise?
If I understand the question right, the subject matter expertise that you might be referring to is, say, you know about transportation, right? Or you know about some field that versus just the raw creativity that raw creativity everybody has. I think when I talk about the raw creativity, I'm aligning to the fact that design is not a domain discipline; it is a process discipline. right? A designer does not claim to have any domain knowledge, really. In my own career, I've designed a telephone that's in all the post offices in India. I've worked on a bunch of software products that are used by a billion plus people. I've designed learning, I've designed an automobile, and I've done, but the process I've used for all of that has been only a single process, because I don't have domain expertise in any of those areas, but I do have process expertise at a high level that I can apply it regardless of the domain. So when I think about the expertise of design, it's primarily a process expertise, and the process expertise, when you become expert at it, you are able to use in a very elastic way to apply it to any kinds of problem at different scale, regardless of atoms or bits or experiences, services, or learning or whatever. Did that answer your question? Could you? I can't see the chat, unfortunately. So I'm all right. I see a chat now. Yes. Hi, Ali. Good to see you.
He adds, the design process expertise you refer to involves a lot of domain learning up front, for example, research.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I guess it's the use of, I guess, the domain. I think about sort of, I'm thinking when I use domain expertise, I think about it as what you may have, I use the word domain as what you went and studied maybe in school to understand a domain, versus I think about that research is specific to that particular problem area you're working on, the kind of research and data that you need so it builds sufficient empathy. And that does not persist at the end of that problem or that particular, I mean, I think of, say, domain expertise. If you say you're a cardiologist, that is something you have deep domain expertise in cardiology.
So we have time here for just one more question. It's from Natalie. She said, she admitted that she's still a bit confused. She got the homeless example, but how would the design swarm process change for a different type of problem?
It would change for a different kind of problem. For instance, if you are working on a problem which is, say, more about iteration, you needed to, so it's, you don't, and again, the whole process was set up for folks who, the presumption is didn't know anything about design. For instance, you don't know how to set up a A/B test. You don't know how to run an experiment, right? So another a process map would say, this is how you create a hypothesis. And based on the hypotheses, this is how you might, this is a method by which you create an AA test and an AB test. And this is how you would go through running that, right? They may be a process which you had your, a problem that may have to do with dealing with inclusion in a very big way, right? And so then there would be process map that you deal with where you understand where the usefulness of using a persona spectrum versus using just personas, right? So each process map has a different reason that is useful. And what we looked at were much more of the general process map. Natalie, could you type if that got to answer your question? Do you have any follow up on that?
One quick one while we get that. Do you have any case studies available online using swarms?
Yes, they are. At the moment, though, it would be really a search of swarms. A lot has been written about it. Honestly, it hasn't all been compiled into one place with a whole bunch of case studies on swarm. That is happening right now as we're building the certification program around it, having a set of case studies. So it isn't neatly tied up and together yet. But today, if you were to do a search, you'll find videos and articles and case studies others have written about it.
Well, listen, Surya, thank you so much for your talk this evening. It was really enlightening, as always, and gave us a lot to think about. Um, I want to invite everybody to come to our next webinar next month with Cheryl Kababa, who is the Vice President of Strategy at Substantial, and would look forward to having all of you back, and bring a friend next time. Thank you, Surya, and thanks Products That Count for hosting this event tonight.